This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Hello, everyone. This is Cale Clarke for The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio. So glad that you're joining me today for this episode, our final episode in the Jesus 101 series. And we've been kind of capping off this series on Jesus and history by looking at the 5 minimal facts surrounding his resurrection. These are 5 historical facts that the vast majority of scholars all around the world believe to be true, no matter what they personally believe about religion. The fact that Jesus died on a Roman cross, the fact that his tomb was found to be empty on Easter Sunday morning, the fact that his disciples thought that they encountered him alive from the dead on Easter and afterwards, the conversion of St. Paul. And also, we're going to look at the last fact right now, fact number 5, the conversion of Jesus' skeptical relative James, who goes from really making fun of Jesus prior to Easter to becoming the Bishop of Jerusalem and also a martyr for Jesus. So let's look at this last minimal fact. And again, the whole point of this is that the only argument, or really the only explanation that makes sense of all these facts is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. But we're talking here about James, the relative of Jesus. He's not one of the sons of Zebedee. It might surprise you to know that James really, along with many other relatives of Jesus, really weren't that convinced, I don't think, about the fact that he was the Messiah early in his career. But what happened? When you read the New Testament, there are a lot of cases where they're just super skeptical. In Mark chapter 6, we see that Jesus goes to his hometown of Nazareth, and when the Sabbath comes, he teaches in the synagogue, and people were amazed. And it says here in verse 2, "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that has been given to him that he even does miracles? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "Only in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house is a prophet without honor." Now, of course, these are not other children of Mary, these quote-unquote brothers and sisters of Jesus. They are in all likelihood relatives, though, and we'll get into that another time when we have more time. But we can also look at the Gospel of John, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. You can also, by the way, go back to Mark here for a second. In Mark chapter 3, we have a similar incident in which Jesus is teaching. He's in a home. There's a great big crowd there. And it says that he entered a house, a crowd gathered. He and his disciples were not even able to eat. There's just so many people there. Verse 21, when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." So, to say the least, they weren't super convinced about his messiahship at that point. You can also look at John chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, where it does seem like the relatives of Jesus are not only disbelieving, but they're kind of taunting him in a certain sense. So, we also can note the crucifixion scene. Jesus' family members are not there other than his mother, Mary. And that's one of the reasons why John, the apostle, obviously takes Mary into his home. His relatives are nowhere to be found. But after Easter, it's a different story. If you look at the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verse 14, for example, it talks about the relatives of Jesus in the upper room with all of the other disciples, the apostles, and Mother Mary, and they're waiting, of course, upon the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then we see in many sources in the New Testament how James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. He's very active, of course, in the Council of Jerusalem, mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, but we can also go back to Acts chapter 12. We see Galatians, of course, after his conversion, Paul goes to meet Peter and James in Jerusalem. It's all over Galatians. And we see later in the Acts of the Apostles, in Acts chapter 21, Paul kind of goes to Jerusalem to see James, and he kind of gives him, hey, here's the lowdown, here's what I've been up to. It's almost like he's almost reporting to him in a certain sense. And so this is really intriguing. This is transformation. And we know that according to Josephus, he was martyred as the Bishop of Jerusalem in a grisly way. So something happened. I think clearly what happened was resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus. And this is why he has changed his mind completely. And that Corinthian Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7 specifically mentions a resurrection appearance made to James. And certainly that would convince me if Jesus rose from the dead and showed up, and I got to actually experience this personally. And that is exactly what happened with James as well. So we have two skeptics here. In the conversion of Paul, and he's not just a skeptic, he's outwardly hostile towards the early church. And then we have the conversion of James. So these are the 5 minimal facts. I think the best explanation for these facts is clearly the resurrection of the Lord. But not everybody agrees. There are, of course, skeptics out there who want to raise objections. So let's look at some of the major objections to the resurrection of Jesus, and we'll see why they really don't hold any water. In terms of these objections, Manette and many others have laid them out quite clearly. The first one that we're all probably aware of is the stolen body theory. A lot of people think that the disciples stole the body, and in fact, in Matthew's gospel, that is the claim of the religious authorities, that they stole the body. They know that they're inventing the story. They know it didn't happen, and they're trying to explain the fact that the tomb is empty. But everybody agrees that the tomb is empty. It's very interesting. Now, obviously, this falls apart basically because it's totally implausible. People do die for things that they absolutely believe. They're absolutely willing to die for what they believe to be true, but nobody dies for what they know is a lie. Again, if the apostles had somehow showed up, fought off the guards, gotten the dead body of Jesus out of the tomb, hid it in the trunk of a car, why would they then go preach that he's risen from the dead, risk their lives, get killed in grisly ways, and they know it's all not true? It's highly implausible. So, I mean, it just doesn't hold any water. What about the second major objection that people have to the resurrection of Jesus? Well, this one is known as the swoon theory. The swoon theory. This was highly popular among German theologians and scholars in the 19th century, but nobody really buys this today. But you might have heard about this. The swoon theory holds that Jesus never actually really died on the cross. He was badly beaten. He'd suffered a lot of blood loss. He's been crucified, for goodness sakes. And he just really was in bad shape. And he really just needed a rest. He just kind of passed out on the cross, and people thought he was dead. They bury him, and then he somehow revives himself. He just needed a rest in a cool, dark place, in a tomb, and he's kind of wrapped in the bandages, and he's just kind of snug there, like swaddling clothes, like when he was an infant. And the aloe and spices were kind of invigorating to him, and somehow after a long, long nap, he just kind of wakes up and says, "I feel so much better. I'm out of here." He just unbandages himself, walks on his nail-pierced feet over to the stone, rolls it away himself, pushes it up the hill, fights off the guards, walks into the city, drags himself over to the home where Peter and all the others are hiding out, knocks on the door, and Peter opens the door and says, "Wow, you're gloriously risen from the dead." No, they would have been like, "Get this guy a doctor stat. He is in incredibly rough shape." Okay, first of all, this is so implausible. It's almost embarrassing to even mention it that people think this. Interestingly enough, Jesus would not have had to be resurrected to be the Messiah. There was no belief in Jesus' time that the Messiah would rise from the dead. Now, don't get me wrong. All Orthodox Jews, and by Orthodox I mean right-believing Jews of Jesus' day, did believe in resurrection. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. Obviously, Jesus believed in resurrection. The Sadducees didn't. The Sadducees, who controlled the high priesthood, the temple establishment, they did not believe in the afterlife, angels, resurrection, heaven, hell, didn't believe in any of it. But of course, right-thinking Jews did, for very, very good reason. Everyone thought that there was going to be a general resurrection at the end of time. Jesus talked about this a lot in his preaching. But nobody thought that anybody would be resurrected in time. They all thought it would come at the end of the world. You say, what about Lazarus? Lazarus was not resurrected. He was resuscitated by Jesus. He would die again. When you're resurrected, you're alive forevermore in a glorified, resurrected body. So this idea that the Messiah had to be resurrected, nobody thought that. So in a way, you could say it would have been even more impressive if Jesus had survived the crucifixion and somehow lived to tell the tale. Wow, not even the Romans could kill this guy. So it's just an unbelievable story. Jesus was in absolutely terrible shape. There's no way if he had somehow survived the crucifixion, he would have been able to convince people that he was resurrected, and they would have preached that he was resurrected. No. But he didn't survive it. He did die, and that was guaranteed by the coup de grace, the lance of the Roman soldier who ran him through his heart with that lance. And as we know, according to Scripture, blood and water came pouring out of that wound in his side. That's what John says in his gospel. He claims to be an eyewitness. And that's an actual physical condition. It's called a pleurocardial effusion. A sort of a sac of liquid builds up around the heart muscle when you're under extreme physical stress and torture. And it would have looked as if water came out of his side along with blood, of course. But we know there's a deeper meaning to this. This is, of course, symbolic of the sacraments of the church, of baptism and the Eucharist. The bride of Christ comes forth from his side, just as with the first Adam, Eve was fashioned from his side when he was asleep. And Jesus, the second Adam, in the sleep of death, his bride, the church, comes forth out of his side on the cross. I mean, that's obviously a theological point, but back to the historical reality, but there's no way that Jesus survived the crucifixion. We know his death is verified by historical sources, even outside of the Bible. Another big objection that people have, and I remember getting an email about this some months ago, somebody asking me about this. It's called the who moved the body theory, or the displaced body theory. Essentially, what's going on here is the thought process is that Joseph of Arimathea, and all four of the Gospels mention this guy, gave Jesus a proper burial along with Nicodemus, but later on, he moved the body from his own tomb to somewhere else. So, of course, the women are there. They see Jesus buried on Good Friday. And then when they come back to the tomb after the Sabbath, they come back on Easter Sunday, the first day of the week. They find the tomb is empty. And then they run away saying, hey, Jesus has been raised from the dead. But really, his body's in another tomb. What's the big problem with this theory? Well, the big problem, of course, is this doesn't account for the appearances of Jesus, the appearances of the resurrected Jesus after his crucifixion, death, and burial. So you still have to deal with all the resurrection appearances. How do you explain those? An empty tomb alone does not a resurrection make. You also have the appearances. The other thing, too, is just from a common sense point of view, don't forget that the most likely thing that would have happened, if the women had come and found the tomb to be empty, they wouldn't have automatically assumed resurrection. Again, because nobody imagined that somebody would be resurrected in time. It would all come at the end of time. What they probably would have done, what they likely would have done, is say, well, who moved the body? Where's the body? They wouldn't have said he's resurrected from the dead. The reason why they believe the resurrection is because Jesus appeared to them alive from the dead. They saw him, they touched him. But Jesus says to Mary, hey, don't hold on to me right now. I've got to go see my brothers, tell them about this. And that's exactly what did happen. Because if you look at John chapter 20, verses 11 through 18, this is where Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. He's not there. She doesn't know it's Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener, but it's Jesus risen from the dead. And she says, look, if you move the body, tell me where the body is so that I can go and pay my respects, because we've got to do this. And then that's when he says, Mary. And she when he calls her name, she knows it's him. She's like, wow, Rabbi, it's you, alive from the dead. So that's in all likelihood what would happen. But again, this doesn't account for the resurrection appearances of Jesus. This entire episode of The Faith Explained is on the Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers. Don't delay. Download the app today, and thanks for listening.